Good glowing day, Adam's children, and welcome to this week's sermon that is all about examining the internet in the Fallout universe. My primary objective is to determine if there is such a thing in Fallout as our modern conception of the internet, to investigate how Fallout uses its internet, what it looks like and is capable of, and then to use all these clues to determine what approximate time frame in our world Fallout's internet is the closest to. There are some details that make me pretty confident in my conclusion, but I can't just tell you outright. Or, well, I guess I could, but I need to show you the evidence for my claim to give it any weight. So crank up the rads and fire up your Robco terminal as we look at the internet in the Fallout world. Also be sure to stay till the end because I have another community highlight that is a fun and really cool project for all you tech nerds. If we are to try and determine if Fallout's internet is anything like ours, it's important to get a working definition of what we mean when we refer to the internet in our modern day. This isn't a video on the history of the internet, so I only want to cover details that will help us investigate the Fallout world, so this definition will be concise and not exhaustive, so as not to make all of you wish for a nuclear winter. The name internet was first coined in 1974, well before its actual implementation, which first took place largely between 1989 and 1991. What we call the internet is a worldwide, that is an important part, system of networks that are all able to connect and speak to each other using a specific protocol called the Internet Protocol Suite, or TCP/IP for short. Really, the important bits are the global reach, that it's not just a network, but a network of networks, and it uses specific technologies and protocols to operate, like TCP/IP and packet switching. Okay, that is our target. How well does Fallout's internet stack up? Well, the first and most obvious thing, if you have ever played even a few minutes of Fallout and spent any time on a terminal, that absolutely nothing in the Fallout universe approaches the well-curated websites and smooth operating apps that we use on a daily basis, and that you're using right now to watch this. We almost exclusively see text on displays, with maybe some animations, like on the Pip-Boy, often in green and yellow, which reflect the type of phosphor the screens used, which were specifically chosen because of their long afterglow effect, and back in the day that was useful because of the low refresh rate of computers. Alright, so right off the bat, it is obvious that if the internet as we know it exists, it is going to look a lot different in the games. Given Fallout's retrofuturism, rather than starting at the internet's present incarnation and going back in time until we find common ground, let's go to the early developmental stages of the internet and see if the evidence in Fallout parallels our own. The simplest and first step of building a network of networks is to have these smaller networks with which to network. That made less sense than I hoped it would. Essentially, small networks known as LANs or local area networks were an early milestone in the long journey to the internet, and as such are an important component. We are all well acquainted with LANs even if we don't know it today, since a business network, a school network, or even a home network are all considered LANs, and they're just a network of devices over a small geographical location, like a building. Similar to how LANs are everywhere in our world, Fallout has a ton of these, and the evidence is everywhere. Some of these LANs are explicitly named when booting a terminal that is on the network. The Sierra Madre has multiple networks for their resort, a security, maintenance, service, and managing network. The ArcJet company and facility in Fallout 4 has its own ARPANET, and the Wilson Automatoys Corporation has their CorpNet network. However, the vast majority of LANs that we run across as we explore gutted and destroyed buildings won't have some clever name or an explicit reference to a network. Rather, we will find evidence of multiple terminals throughout the building, having messages to and from others in the same facility, or company-wide announcements that can be found on every terminal. Such networks can be found all over, but to name just a scant few, they can be found at the Hubris Comics location in Boston, the Nuka-Cola plant in Fallout 3, the RepCon headquarters in New Vegas, and the Pleasant Valley cabins in Fallout 76. Small locations had them like a sheriff station's internal network, And the government had its fair share as well, like at Black Mountain, the Museum of Technology, and you know what? I'm throwing the vaults in here too, since Vault Tech was basically functioning as a non-official branch of the government in the days leading up to the Great War. They are found across all the games, particularly in Bethesda's later titles, and while they don't prove much about Fallout's internet, they do show a similar basic building block to the real-world internet. Local area networks are important, but the next big step is the implementation of and use of wide area networks, or WANs. They are different from LANs in that they service a much larger area, typically the size of a city and larger, and involve the participation of a third party to build, maintain, and permit access, something not needed for LANs. Lastly, they use different connectivity technologies, where LANs have primarily used Ethernet since the 1970s. WANs utilize fiber optics and signal amplifiers in order to pump information across large distances. So do we have evidence of WANs in the Fallout world? While there are far fewer examples when compared to LANs, some are easy to identify because they are explicitly named, while others can be implied based on the messages we find on terminals. We know of a handful of WANs, the first two of which appear to be the smallest in size. The city of Watoga in Fallout 76 was special in that they decided to take automation to an absurd level in the pursuit of the city of the future. All work was done by a number of robots, with the mayor being the only human in a position of power, but even that role would be determined at random by an automated system. Part of this project involved a city-wide network that was used enthusiastically by its inhabitants and was also necessary for issuing commands and getting constant updates from the teams of robots that were keeping the city running. This network is actually worth a closer look, which we will do a bit later when determining how these networks were used. Suffice it to say that this is one of the smaller WANs that we have sure knowledge of. There was another WAN that we can deduce existed in what is now called the Divide in the Lonesome Road add-on. The Divide used to be a large military complex that encompassed two small cities, Hopeville and Ashton, and before the Great War reduced the inhabitants to a small group clinging for survival, and before the courier unknowingly delivered a package that would detonate the sleeping nuclear warheads hidden in the silos underneath, this sprawling pre-war and rather idyllic area had a military network. The primary evidence for this consists of only a couple messages between a specialist who worked at the wastewater treatment plant and Commander Devlin, who was an officer at the Hopeville missile base. While the substance of their correspondence doesn't really have much bearing on what we're looking at here, it is rather funny since the commander calls Specialist Rothschild a pink commie-eyed puke for asking for more resources to ensure everyone at the base would have clean drinking water. America. The important part is that the wastewater treatment plant is well outside of Hopeville to the north, and thus some sort of large network would need to be in place to allow for communication. In another part of the Mojave, Father Elijah, the former elder of the Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood, was able to establish contact with the Sierra Madre network from well outside of the Sierra Madre itself. It is not clear how this is done, but a terminal in the abandoned Brotherhood bunker shows evidence of Elijah having hacked or otherwise tricked the Sierra Madre automated systems to deliver Sierra Madre chips to a drop-off location after beating the DLC, as stated in an automated reply from the Sierra Madre management. More evidence comes from the Honest Hearts DLC, from a terminal in the Zion General Store. Zion Canyon is a rather remote location in our world, and appears to have been sparsely populated in the Fallout world as well, but it did have its own Zion National Park network. The manager, Horace Applebaum, has 2 emails that he sent out to 2 different people, one to a representative of a shipping company that was meant to deliver some survival kits, and the other to a scoutmaster who was intending on bringing his scout troop to Zion for a bus tour that, ended poorly. Both the shipping company and the scoutmaster are implied to be well outside of Zion Canyon itself, and so for him to be communicating to them via email, and yes, the terminal expressly calls these messages emails, more on that in a bit, there would needs be some sort of WAN that facilitates the transmission of these emails. Another good example that is implied to exist of what could be a government WAN is pre-war collaboration between 2 supercomputers, the Zax computer that would become known as John Henry Eden in Raven Rock, and Modus in the White Springs bunker in Appalachia. The two AIs have recorded dialogue where they were to run a number of simulations, but then they got caught up in some abstract conversations about what it means to find something interesting, since Eden became fixated on past US presidents. What is the best of all examples, however, is the one and only Poseidonet. Poseidonet? Which is a very large network that was first shown in Fallout 2. Poseidon Energy was the largest energy producer in the United States prior to the Great War and was in bed with the US military to an astonishing degree. In the Poseidon nuclear plant in Fallout 2, which is located in the ghoul town of Gecko, we can explore a terminal that is linked to Poseidonet. Entering in a security access code grants access to the network and reveals some of the other locations that are also connected to Poseidonet. And there are some real heavy hitters. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, is connected to Poseidonet, presumably at their Cheyenne Mountain complex in Colorado, as is the Strategic Air Command, which was a command within the US Department of Defense. It is also connected to smaller but more plot-relevant locations in Fallout 2, namely an oil refinery in Navarro, which is the area where the Enclave established a base, Control Station Enclave, which is the current Enclave base of operations, located on an offshore Poseidon oil rig, and a location called Enclave Vault Research Control, which is just an unknown location that we can assume links the Enclave with the Vault Tech vaults. Those are just the locations mentioned in Fallout 2, but the other games expand this even further. The Helios 1 station in New Vegas is linked to Poseidonet, as is their satellite, Archimedes 2, and 2 nuclear power plants in West Virginia are confirmed to be connected to Poseidonet. That is an enormous distance to cover. It stretches all the way from off the coast of California to Nevada, Colorado, over to the East Coast in Appalachia. This enormous network that was leveraged heavily by the US military, but also included non-military assets, namely Poseidon energy facilities, seems rather reminiscent of the real-world ARPANET. ARPANET is the name given to the first ultra-wide-scale network that used advanced technologies that our modern internet uses, like packet switching and TCP/IP. It is considered by most to be the originator of the internet, and it is difficult to understate its importance in the eventual creation of the internet. ARPANET got its name because it was primarily funded by ARPA, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency, which would eventually be renamed to its modern incarnation, DARPA. Yeah, that one. From its inception, ARPANET was considered first and foremost a research project, an attempt to create a network on a scale that hadn't been achieved before, and as a result, the first 4 locations to be linked together in this network, in what are called nodes, successfully connected in 1969. ARPANET would continue to expand through the next decade, and we can see some similarities between Poseidonet and ARPANET in the games. They were both transcontinental networks, and in Fallout, Poseidonet is the only known network to cover such a large range. ARPANET was primarily used by researchers who would go on to expand the network and increase the number of nodes, even giving it transatlantic reach by connecting to the University College London and the Norway Seismic Array via a satellite connection. Although we can't be sure of the beginning of Poseidonet, it is most likely that it was conceived and funded by Poseidon Energy in cooperation with the US government, since we can see the network connecting both to Poseidon-owned facilities like power plants and oil rigs, as well as critical US military installations like NORAD and the Strategic Air Command. Poseidonet is also confirmed to have satellite connectivity, just like ARPANET, except instead of connecting to a giant space laser of death, it just connected to Norway. Womp womp. Just kidding, love you Norway. Although ARPANET and Poseidonet seem to have slightly different beginnings, the military did have a keen interest in utilizing both networks in Fallout and in our world. ARPANET would eventually come under the purview of the military in 1975 when the Defense Communication Agency took stewardship. I think this era, when ARPANET was primarily controlled by the military, is the most analogous to what we see in Fallout with Poseidonet. And what is interesting is that at some point in the real world, the military would cleave off a large portion of ARPANET to make a new network, specifically for military traffic, that would come to be called MILNET in 1983. So that may be an important point in time as we try to zero in on what period of time the real world is closest to Fallout in regards to the internet. The thing is though, as much as we've been talking about ARPANET, it was not the internet. It set the stage for the modern internet, it proved the technologies that would be used for the internet, and part of the infrastructure would be used for a time in the early days of the internet. There were a number of WANs in addition to ARPANET, and more would spring up as time went on. The earliest example was a military network called SAGE that was built to connect ground radar systems in order to rapidly coordinate interceptors in the event of Soviet bombers intruding in American airspace. Even American Airlines got in really early, working in cooperation with IBM to build a network called Sabre to make the process of booking flights easier and less time-consuming through computation in 1964. This is all to say that while ARPANET was a marvel of modern engineering and science because of its scale and the technologies used, it was just one big fish, or the big fish, in a pond of smaller networks that themselves would multiply and expand with time. This seems similar to what we see in Fallout, because while we have this huge sprawling Poseidonet, we also have evidence of other WANs. Father Elijah was able to connect from the abandoned underground bunker to the Sierra Madre network, and there's a possibility that this was done leveraging an existing network. Although it is entirely possible that Elijah engineered some hacky way to connect to the Sierra Madre using that silly little brain of his. What is more convincing though are the emails that we mentioned that were sent from the Zion General Store to a shipping company, as well as a scoutmaster. When accessing the terminal, it doesn't talk about connecting to Poseidonet, but the Zion National Park network, and that is unlike every other terminal that we know is connected to Poseidonet. Additionally, while Poseidonet seemed to connect to military sites and Poseidon energy installations, having a node in what is essentially the middle of nowhere would certainly be an odd choice. Also, I'm allowed to call that part of Utah the middle of nowhere because I'm from Utah. Additionally, whatever network these emails were sent on were able to go to a shipping company, which that itself is not all that remarkable, but it was also able to go to one single individual, some random scoutmaster. Again, all these clues point to the existence here of separate, non-Poseidonet WANs. With this in mind, I think it is most probable that the network landscape was a complicated system of networks that may have been completely isolated from one another, or may have shared some connections to expand even more coverage. This would be analogous to our real world, starting in the 70s, with the growth of newer and bigger networks accelerating in the 1980s and into the 1990s. See, before we had one World Wide Web to rule them all, telecommunication companies like CompuServe were getting their start in the 1970s, and they were hitting their stride in the 1980s, where they were building their own networks of networks, mini internets, if you will, but they charged consumers for access to these networks, and unless there was explicit agreement and cooperation between these network providers, users would be locked in to that network. Didn't matter if the best fan fiction Deathclaw erotica was on a separate network. If you weren't on that network, you couldn't access it. But in this case, that's probably for the better. We do have evidence of the commercialization of network access on a terminal on the oil rig in Fallout 2. The terminals were using trial access to Poseidonet, which the terminal helpfully explains is only 59,392 days overdue. But this is worth noting, because while this is behavior similar to the smaller networks that were growing through the 80s, commercialization of ARPANET was actually not allowed. The greatest irony of all this, though, is that Poseidon oil rig was running trial software for Poseidonet, which is just so on brand for Fallout. So we have a vague idea of what the network landscape looked like. Smaller networks that may or may not have been interconnected or mostly isolated, dominated by one large transcontinental network, heavily used by the government and Poseidon Energy with the ability to interface with satellites. But that still isn't the internet. Joe Schmo isn't logging in on his terminal in the morning, firing up his Poseidonet connection to come to the depressing conclusion that Fallout 5 won't be released for another 10 years. There certainly are aspects of the internet, though, that we share in common that should be discussed because they might help us out a bit. The first we have already mentioned is email. We see messages that are sent across the network in a format very close to what our emails look like. And in some instances, they are just straight up called emails. Emails have been around for a while though, starting in 1971 on, you guessed it, ARPANET. But publicly available email solutions wouldn't become available until the early 1980s, where they would increase in popularity through the decade. We know the networks send information via packets, and maybe use packet switching, which is an important aspect of the modern internet. This may be hinted at by a small side mission in New Vegas where the followers of the apocalypse asked the courier to install a packet sniffer on House's Lucky 38 network. In Fallout 2, we get to see another rare but super interesting aspect of Poseidonet, the ability for two-way video calls. Digital video calls or video conferencing was made possible in the early 1980s, but were mainly relegated to large, expensive computers that, realistically, could be found at any of the Poseidon sites. They'd be able to afford such things. So again, the time period we're looking at is the early 80s up through the 90s, before tech shrank enough and internet protocol video conferencing was made cheaper and more accessible. What I think is a really great marker for us, though, is the mention of bulletin board systems or BBSs in both Fallout 4 and Fallout 76. For those too young to know what a BBS is, and don't worry, I'm not calling you out, I also had no idea what these were. These were digital public messaging boards where people could make posts, upload or download data, read news, and send messages to each other. BBSs were invented in 1978, but would really hit their stride in the early 1980s as technology advanced and allowed more people to access networks. Most BBSs had no graphical interface in the early days, rather they relied on ASCII text, like we see in Fallout, and later on even some ANSI art. BBSs would really get popular through the 80s and into the 90s, and an entire multi-million-dollar industry would rise up based on hosting and writing software for BBSs. Basically, this entire industry would crash spectacularly through the mid-1990s with the rise of the internet and the introduction of graphical user interfaces for web browsers, something that does not exist in Fallout. So once again, the popularity of the BBS in Watoga and the mention of one by Imogen Cabot in Fallout 4 means that they were pretty popular, and the largely ASCII-based interface would be closest to the early to late 80s in our world. Imogen Cabot in Fallout 4 even mentions hacking a Robco database server from their home. Again, more evidence of what appears to be wide area networks. And would you look at that, an emoticon. Emoticons are first attributed to a computer scientist who popularized a smiley and frowny emoticon on, wouldn't you know it, a BBS in 1982. Maybe she learned about emoticons on one of the many BBSs that she liked to cruise. Now, what is one of my favorite things that I came across while researching for this video is an interface that was developed in 1990 just as the World Wide Web was starting to come online. It was meant to allow users to more easily access resources like libraries and other public-facing resources using the Telnet protocol. Essentially, users were able to connect through a virtual terminal to servers and mainframes, which would often include BBSs that we spoke of earlier. What I love about this interface, known as Telnet, is that the original format looks remarkably similar to the terminals that we often use in Fallout when they are linked to a network of some type. Even these archived pages are meant to evoke the original terminal look, and it looks right at home in Fallout. This is fairly representative of what it was like to connect both in the pre-internet days and before graphical user interfaces became mainstream, with things like the NCSA Mosaic browser that completely revolutionized internet use. So, considering everything I presented, what is the conclusion? Let's do a recap. ARPANET, which is very analogous to Poseidonet, was demilitarized in 1983, so that is the latest date we could really compare the two. We have a number of other networks that offer paid and trial access, just like the years before 1991 when the internet officially went live. Emails are used fairly frequently, which started in the 70s and have been extremely popular ever since. Digital video conferencing was largely the domain of businesses that could shell out serious money in the 1980s, and that is similar to what we see in Fallout 2. BBSs were popular in Fallout and grew rapidly in popularity in the 1980s before their untimely demise in the mid-1990s. We see use of an emoticon, which was first used in the 80s and would continue to increase in popularity with time as well. And finally, with Fallout's text-only approach and lack of graphical interfaces, which came onto the scene in 1993 with the advent of the World Wide Web, and is very reminiscent of the 1980s when pre-internet users were sending messages, uploading and downloading software, and reading and sharing news. All these factors together makes me confident saying that Fallout's internet, while it does not look like ours, lacks many features that ours does, and doesn't appear to have the same global or even national reach and saturation, is most like the network and online landscape of America between approximately 1983 and 1990, before the actual internet came into being. Some fun extra tidbits here. There's actually a reference in the first Fallout to the, quote, interweb, which is the closest the series comes to acknowledging anything like our concept of an internet, and can be seen when using terminals in the Vault library sometimes. A reference to Microsoft's Outlook email system was referenced by the Inlook mail system at the wastewater treatment plant, no doubt coded by Gil Bates himself. Not all computer-based communication was done over networks. Sometimes messages were written and saved to holotapes, and then sent in the mail, like we can see with the Mistress of Mystery in Fallout 76. Lastly, the post-war internet situation seems to largely use pre-war systems like Poseidonet, and the new network, EnclaveNet, which probably piggybacks off the old network systems. The Prydwen in Fallout 4 also sends emails to the Capital Wasteland, and since it's floating up in the sky, there's a chance that it does this via radio waves, similar to Hawaii's first network, which was established in 1971, called AlohaNet, because of course it was. So what do you think? Is there anything I missed that might have changed my estimation? Are you yourself convinced? I would be really interested to hear what you have to say about what Fallout's internet was actually like. As promised, I have another community highlight, one that is quite applicable to the topic at hand because it is a project undertaken by a friend known as Crazy Smile, who programmed the first real operational Robco OS. It is functionally MS-DOS, and so it can run programs that work on MS-DOS and play games that work on MS-DOS, including, drumroll please, the first Fallout game itself. That's right, things are getting super meta in here, playing Fallout on Robco OS. It takes a bit of effort to get working right, and the easiest way to run Robco OS is by virtualizing it in a VirtualBox, unless you are truly hardcore and have a hardware that would support it. If you would like to play around with it, or heck, even help expand the project, you can find the GitHub repo in the description. Crazy Smile is a damn good programmer, so if you would like to collab with him or use his talents, you can find his Discord handle in the description. Thank you all for being here with me, talking about my favorite game series in the warmth of Adam's glow, and a special thanks to my patrons and YouTube members who give me that little extra support, and if you would like to join their ranks, I have more info in the description. Embrace division, brothers and sisters. Take care of yourselves and all of Adam's creations. Now I'll see you soon.